Hey everyone, Aaron Denton, Denton Claims Consulting, simplifying insurance claims. Today I want to talk about something that creates a surprising amount of confusion, not just for property owners, but even within the insurance and legal industries. Are public adjusters allowed to operate in Kansas? Well, short answer, yes. But the reason is actually misunderstood and is a very good example of how insurance laws are written, interpreted, and often misunderstood. A lot of people assume that if a state has a public adjuster licensing act, then public adjusting must be broadly regulated across all claims types. The assumption makes sense on the surface, but insurance statutes are rarely written in broad sweeping terms. Kansas is a perfect example of why statutory language matters. Kansas law defines public adjusting very narrowly. Specifically, the statute focuses on first party claims arising under commercial lines insurance contracts, meaning the act itself is written within a commercial policy framework. And this is where confusion often begins, because what the statute defines is not automatically the same thing as what it prohibits. The Kansas Public Adjusters Licensing Act governs public adjusting activity tied to commercial lines insurance, but the statute does not contain language broadly prohibiting public adjusting outside that commercial definition. In other words, residential public adjusting is not banned by the act. In fact, this exact issue was addressed by the Kansas Attorney General in a formal opinion last September of 25. The Attorney General clarified that the Public Adjuster Licensing Act neither regulates nor prohibits adjusting for claims arising under residential lines contracts. Put simply, the statute defines what it governs. It does not automatically outlaw everything outside that definition, and this distinction is incredibly important in insurance law. Most people, understandably, think the law operates in a blanket fashion, meaning if something isn't explicitly allowed, it must be prohibited. But statutory interpretation doesn't work that way, especially in regulatory frameworks. When legislators draft statutes, they are often targeting very specific conduct. They are not always attempting to regulate an entire universe of related activity. Kansas is a classic example of this. And this type of statutory nuance is something we deal with constantly in insurance claims, not just in Kansas, but across all the states we operate in. Insurance law is filled with highly specific definitions that drive very real world consequences. I've seen property owners, contractors, and even professionals in this industry hesitate or feel uncertain about public adjusting in Kansas simply because of the assumptions about the Licensing Act. And that uncertainty usually comes from misunderstanding about how narrowly the statute is written. This is actually one of the biggest themes I try to educate our clients on, and more recently, our residential clients in Kansas. Insurance policies are contracts. Insurance statutes are regulatory frameworks. Both rely heavily on precise language, and precise language in insurance law often behaves very differently than people expect. A definition within a statute limits the scope of regulation. It does not automatically create a universal prohibition. That's a fundamental legal concept, but one that frequently gets lost in everyday discussions. When people rely on assumptions instead of statutory language, misunderstandings occur. And in the insurance world, misunderstandings can be expensive. After a loss, property owners are already dealing with damage, stress, financial pressure, deadlines, coverage questions, documentation requirements. The last thing they need is confusion about whether they can seek professional assistance from a public adjuster. Now, it's always important to understand what this does not mean. This does not mean public adjusting operates without boundaries. Public adjusters must still avoid the unauthorized practice of law. They must still operate within legal and ethical and consumer protection frameworks. They must still adhere to applicable regulations. The Kansas Attorney General makes this even more clear, noting that public adjusting outside the act is not wholly unrestrained, but Kansas serves as a powerful illustration of something extremely important. Regulation is driven by statutory language, not assumptions. Now, I would like to say this is not legal advice. This is my own interpretation of the laws in the state of Kansas and their Attorney General's opinion. Insurance law requires careful interpretation, as we've illustrated throughout this discussion, rather than surface level conclusions, because what people believe the law says and what it actually says are two very different things. And this dynamic isn't unique to Kansas. We see similar misunderstandings across multiple jurisdictions involving coverage triggers, coverage exclusions, coverage endorsements, licensing statutes, claim handling regulations. This is simply the nature of insurance, a highly technical, contract-driven environment. For property owners, the key takeaway is this: insurance decisions should be guided by documentation, policy language, and applicable law, not generalized assumptions. At Denton Claims Consulting, a large part of our role involves helping our clients navigate these exact type of complexities, not just evaluating damages, but evaluating frameworks, processes, interpretations, positions, because insurance claims are rarely just about damage. They're about how damage is interpreted, documented, and valued. A small misunderstanding in that process can produce very large financial decisions. Insurance policies are complex. Insurance statutes are complex. And when losses occur, clarity becomes incredibly valuable. If you find this type of practical real-world insurance education helpful, follow for more straightforward explanations about how claims, coverage, and insurance laws actually work, because in this space, details matter.